Good afternoon, and welcome to the FEMA Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness webinar series. My name is Allison Albright, and I'm the Regional Preparedness Liaison for FEMA Region 2. I am going to provide a few technical considerations before we begin. Today's proceedings are being recorded and captioned. The archived event will be available on the Region 2 website in the coming days. You should hear audio through your computer speakers, so please ensure your volume is turned up so you may hear the proceedings accordingly. In the top right corner, we ask if you'd like to receive news and updates from Region 2, and if so, please enter your email address and we'll be sure to add you to the distribution list. We will have a question and answer session after the presentation concludes. You'll see there is a Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner. Please feel free to submit your questions about the subject matter there, and time permitting, we'll do our best to answer them. Finally, the PowerPoint presentation from today will be available for you to download in the file share pod at the end of the presentation as a PDF. You can click the file and download it using the download button. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Debbie Costa, Preparedness Specialist with Region 2, to introduce our speaker and today's proceedings.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Debbie Costa, the Preparedness Liaison on the New Jersey FEMA Integration Team. On behalf of our team working to strengthen preparedness across New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our monthly Preparedness and Resilience webinar series. As part of FEMA's strategic plan, our goal one is to build a culture of preparedness. As part of that goal, we're pleased to be hosting this webinar today on the continuous improvement process and how to prepare for and facilitate an after-action review. Continuous improvement can help agencies and organizations drive change after incidents like COVID-19 and exercises and better prepare for future disasters and challenges to be more resilient and prepared for future emergencies. We have three speakers today, beginning with Danell Trissy, and he is the Chief for the National Section of FEMA's Continuous Improvement Program. In that capacity, he oversees the team that conducts national disaster trend analysis, designs consistent data collection methods across all disasters, and develops the technical assistance program for our state, local, territory, and tribal partners to strengthen their continuous improvement capabilities. Tamires Aldorando is the Continuous Improvement Program Unit Lead for the Hurricane Maria Recovery Operation in Puerto Rico. Tammy oversees and coordinates all team efforts, included but not limited to after-action reviews, facilitation, root cause analysis, process improvement, developing corrective actions, trend analysis, and issue resolution. The Continuous Improvement Unit in Puerto Rico reports to the Executive Office and works closely with senior leadership to identify high-priority areas that need CIP support. Last but not least, Michelle Dolinar has been the Region 2 Continuous Improvement Coordinator for nearly a year now. As the CIC, she helps facilitate after-action reviews, corrective action tracking, and process improvement within her FEMA region and with state, territorial, tribal, and local partners. Currently, Michelle is supporting the after-action review for the Region 2 COVID-19 response in New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Danell, would you get us started?
Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to share our passion and interest in continuous improvement with you. We hope that today you walk away with a few new ideas, maybe some new techniques, and overall some excitement for continuous improvement and everything that you can learn through that process. So we're going to cover a lot of materials today, and so I want to just reemphasize the question and answer box on the bottom right. So please go ahead and type questions in as you come up with them during the presentation. We look forward to spending a good amount of time at the end of the presentation answering your questions. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So for the agenda for today, so we have a few things we want to cover. Our overall focus is on an after-action review and everything that entails in that process. And so in order to cover that, we're going to focus most of our time on the discovery phase and the validation phase of the continuous improvement process. Those are the most relevant and applicable areas for conducting after-action review. And then we'll cover at the end a little bit on the resolution and evaluation phases that are a little more applicable to those organizations that maybe have done some continuous improvement activities in the past, and those are that are a little more mature in terms of this type of work. We also want to, at the end, share some tips and suggestions for how we can make continuous improvement more effective, and at the end we'll do a quick review of the course. So as was introduced, we also have Michelle and Tammy on the line. They will also be sharing some more specific examples of how some of the more theoretical things I'll cover, how they've seen them applied in their respective regions and territory as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and start moving along. So what is continuous improvement? And what is an after-action review? So overall, for the continuous improvement, we want to help organizations and entities drive change. So this could be after an incident, after an exercise, so that you can better prepare for future disasters and other challenges that you might be facing as an organization. So I also want to mention here that we call it continuous improvement, but your organization might call it your internal assessments division. It could be your evaluation division, right? So replace continuous improvement or continuous improvement program for whatever terminology works for your organization, right? So we want this to be as broad encompassing as possible to help as many organizations. We have a number of participants here from both state, local entities, private sector, and so please go ahead and adapt this terminology to whatever is the normal nomenclature that you use in your organization. So as I mentioned, we're going to cover the after-action review process. Now that's just one part of the larger continuous improvement process. At the end of the presentation, we'll cover a little bit more what are some of the other elements that come into the continuous improvement process as a whole, so you can sort of understand what are some of the next steps after you get a good basis on doing after-action reviews, where else could you grow. So to define a little bit of what an after-action review involves, so these are the different phases that we'll walk through in the rest of the presentation today. So we're looking at identifying and validating and sharing operational strengths, areas for improvement, best practices, right? So we want to help both identify like what worked and what could be improved, right? So as we mentioned, this could be for an incident, maybe you had some sort of an exercise. It could also be after maybe some type of workshop that you did. You want to also do a little bit of an after-action review to try to learn and make it better next time along. At the end of the after-action review process, you often develop courses of actions to ensure that these strengths are able to be repeated in future incidents. And then you also, any areas that were identified for improvement, what you want to try to identify is areas how you could fix that in future incidents, right? If this is something that you're seeing occurring time after time, then maybe there's different courses of actions you can implement to address those issues. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about, as well, how you track courses of actions until they are completed. So that's going to be our main focus for today. So before we get started, I want to ask the group a question. So as you can see, there's a chat box here that you can see now. So have you worked on an after-action review or continuous improvement project in the past? And if so, what was the topic? So if you could go ahead and type in your answers. I'll pause for a moment so that everyone has a moment to type in. Okay, so we're seeing some tabletop exercises. For those of you that aren't familiar with tabletops, so that's when you simulate an incident, but sitting around a table, and so you're not doing an actual functional exercise. You're possibly gathering together with leadership and some key individuals to work through some of those exercises or things that could potentially happen in a real-world incident. Okay, and we have a number of folks that are new to this process, and so that's exciting, so welcome. We're always excited to recruit new folks into the continuous improvement world. Let's see, we have active shooter drills. No, that's great. Some lessons learned reports. So great. So we have a good variety. We've had some folks do after-action exercises. I bet some of you are probably also involved in looking at COVID-19 response operations for your organizations and entities. And so that's great. So hopefully some of this can also be helpful for you in that process. So great. So we'll move on to looking a little bit more about the continuous improvement process. And so what is the continuous improvement process? And so we have organized the process into kind of these major 4 phases that occur. So you can see the graphic on the right outlines the 4 phases, right? So we have the discovery, the validation, resolution, and evaluation. So the overall, the whole process here, right? The purpose of this all is to make sure that we're learning from our past and improving for the future, right? And so if we follow this process, right, it helps make sure that we're being efficient with our staff and resources. We're able to advance preparedness messages and help improve the operations, right? And we're also able to improve the planning and also help all the information sharing, right? So as you'll see a lot about our process today, it's about sharing information, making sure that all the right individuals are involved in each phase of the process so they can improve the operations. And at the end, after you complete your after-action review process, you have a product that really represents everyone's perspective, right? So there's a lot of emphasis we're going to be putting on information sharing throughout the presentation today. And so we'll start with the first phase. So what is the discovery phase? And so in the discovery phase, one second, there we go. So in the discovery phase, it's the overall plan for collection. And so you make a plan for the collection, and then you also, the end goal of the collection is to make sure that you're able to gather information from everyone, right? As I was just mentioning, that is a key aspect of the discovery phase. And so you want to make sure that you have a good plan going into the discovery phase so that you can collect and make sure everyone is aware of all the information. And you are able to engage with all the different individuals at the different levels of the response that occurred. So, and at the end, you want to make sure that you've been able to focus on the priority issues for leadership. This will help improve the effectiveness for new plans and policies and validate risks and assess capabilities, right? So at the end of an incident, you can hopefully now look back and understand, we thought we had this capability, but post our after-action review process, do we have that capability? Or is that actually a risk that we have? And so you're able to validate some of maybe the assumptions you had going into an incident. And so we'll go into each of these phases a little more detail now. So we look at the collection analysis plan. So there's a number of different components that include a really well thought out collection analysis plan. So the overall plan, right, so it begins, you begin creating this collection analysis plan at an early phase, right? So as soon as you know, while an incident's still ongoing, that you're likely to want to do some sort of an after-action review process, right? And the after-action review process could result in an after-action report. Maybe it results in a brief presentation. Maybe it results in a 2-page summary of key points or key takeaways. We're calling it kind of the after-action review at the broadest sense, so that it can be specific to whatever purpose you need, right? So it can be very lengthy, or it can literally just be a meeting that you have and you highlight some of the key points that you've learned through after-action review. And so you'll want to customize your collection analysis plan to whatever is that final state. For the purpose of today's presentation, we're using more of a kind of robust, so assuming that you're creating a pretty comprehensive after-action report at the end of your process, right? That will include observations and courses of actions. And so we'll walk you through kind of the more complete example, but feel free to adapt it to whatever makes sense for your organization. So with the collection analysis plan, it's super important to start this as soon as you know you're going to be doing some sort of an after-action review process. And the reason for that is that when the response is still ongoing, you're probably still able to identify what are the key issues, what are the things that folks later on are going to be asking about. What are they going to want to know if we did well, or if there was areas that we could have improved upon, right? And so that's why you want to start developing the collection analysis plan as soon as you possibly can. And that's why I mentioned that it's going to be a little dynamic, especially at the early phases. So you want to come up with a plan. You'll start sharing it with leadership, getting their input, talking to some of the first responders in the incident to make sure that you're capturing kind of the big topic areas that should be included. And that is super important, that you have some flexibility at the beginning of your process to let the collection analysis plan grow and shrink as needed and as you get guidance and more information. However, before you start doing massive amounts of collection, you do want the plan to start being a little more final, because the plan will guide the rest of your collection priorities and how you collect that information, how you strive to answer those kind of initial areas of the inquiry or those areas of focus areas that you had. And so you do want to kind of, before you do all the massive collection, start to finalize that plan and make sure you have your leadership's approval on a more finalized collection analysis plan. And so a good collection analysis plan will include these 7 components. So I'll walk you through each one of them. So at the beginning, you'll have a brief description of the incident. So you want to include any information that you think is relevant, especially anything that made the incident unique in any capacity. You want to include those elements to make sure that that explains for why you made the certain choices on where to focus on in the incident. You want to discuss the statement of the purpose and scope of the effort. And so as we talked about, maybe you're doing a big report at the end of this, or maybe it's just actually a presentation that you'll complete at the end of this, right? And so this is where you would explain those differences. Then you have the priority focus areas. And so this is what are the specific issues that you will be analyzing, right? So are you focused on the housing that was provided to responders? Maybe you're focused more on the food that moved to the incident site. Maybe you want to look at the search and rescue operations, right? There's a million different things you could focus on, and you honestly cannot focus on everything at once. And so this is where you have to make some tough choices, getting input from your leadership and guidance in terms of what are the most important areas to cover. And so you'll outline these here. And then the next step is for each focus area, you want to outline the methodology for collecting that information, right? So what qualitative and quantitative data would help you answer kind of those focus areas? So how do you look at those things in the most comprehensive way? And so that's what you outline in the methodology, right? So who do you need to interview? What data do you need to analyze in order to really look at that issue holistically, right? And you want to put in as much detail as you can here. You will obviously be fleshing out the methodology as you start doing some of your collection, right, to come up with the specific interview questions and all those things. But the more you can start thinking about that, that helps anyone that you're briefing this collection analysis plan to understand what they will or will not get out of this after-action review process. And so that's always really important to detail a little bit of that methodology. Then you have the roles and responsibilities of the personnel supporting your data collection. So here, you'll likely be listed here as either maybe the lead or a support person on this effort to do this after-action review process. And you also want to list any additional staff that are involved, maybe who's the champion, who's the leadership that's asked you to take this on. So you want to include that information, right? So this becomes a comprehensive list of everyone that's involved. And this also helps you understand that if you don't have that much staff involved in your operation, then maybe to support the data collection, then maybe you need to actually choose fewer focus areas or focus your methodology on doing things more like surveys and things that you can do without having that much staff. So this is also a way we can start thinking about what are the resources you have available. Then on number 6, you'll have a schedule for collection analysis and reporting, making sure that everyone's aware of, when are you starting each phase of the collection, when you expect to have your finalized products. And at the end, we talked already about some of the constraints you might have, right? But if the scope seems to you to be too big, well, this is where you can highlight some of those things to have those conversations with your leadership to help you focus in that information. If the schedule is unrealistic of what is expected of you, then you can explain, so in a 1-month period, I can do this amount of work. In a 2-month period, I can do this amount of work, right? And you can have those conversations with leadership. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle in Region 2 with FEMA to give us an example of how she's selected priorities for a CAP that she has used in her region.
Hi, thanks, Danelle. So really what I'm going to do is I'm going to, kind of reiterate a bit of what Danelle already said and then provide an example of how one priority from the beginning of the collection analysis planning phase to the end of that phase. So in the region, the way that I identify priorities for a collection analysis plan is by working in a team environment and starting out by listening and then going to refine and then moving on to the third phase, which is finalizing my priorities. So with the first phase of listening, I don't claim to be an expert in everything that FEMA does, and so it's really important to listen to the calls and listen to my colleagues who are actually, supporting in response and recovery roles. And by listening to those calls, I can then begin to draft initial takeaways. So what am I hearing that's coming up over and over again that people are stressing? What is important to these people? And that way I can come up with a draft set of priorities. Then as a team with my colleagues and my immediate leadership, I can go and refine those. So what do they think is important? And after we refine those and come up with, an initial draft to bring to our leadership, we then finalize those priorities. So we talk about those with them, and they can actually tell us what is important to them. And we want to know that because we want to have buy-in in this stage. So if our leadership have bought into the things that we're collecting on, then we're going to retain that buy-in throughout the collection and then the analysis phases. So, for example, with COVID-19 operations, one of the priorities that we're looking at is telework operations. So how are we supporting staff in telework? We first identified that by listening to our leadership and our staff talk about, how we're going to support this. And then we refined the scope of it by talking to our immediate leadership and our team, and then we went to finalize that priority into our collection analysis plan.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that information. And also thank you to our first participant that has posted a question in the chat box. So we hope there's many more questions. So as we go over these various elements, we encourage you to go ahead and start putting those questions, and we'll answer them at the end. And so we'll go ahead now into the other part of the discovery phase, which is the data collection, right? So we just talked about in the collection analysis plan, you'll outline what are your methodologies that you will be using to get data on your focus areas. So to emphasize again, and like Michelle was saying, we want to make sure there's a lot of connectivity in your CAP, right? So you only want to do the methodologies that are relevant and applicable to answer kind of the research questions and the focus areas that you have within your CAP, right? And so these are some of the most commonly used methods that we'll go over. And so now we're going to, as many of you mentioned that you've actually been a part of after-action review processes before, we have a question for the group as well. So which of these collection methods have you used in the past, if any? So why don't you take a moment to go ahead and write in some answers there. Great, and so we see we have some hot washes, we have SurveyMonkey, great. For those of you not familiar with SurveyMonkey, is a survey tool that you can do online surveys with. We have other surveys, someone said all of them, which is great. Glad to have folks well experienced in all these items. Let's see what else, we have a direct observation, okay, great. Hot wash I'm seeing a lot. So great, so it looks like we have a good, diverse group of experience, and so feel free to add in some questions in terms of any of these techniques that you've used, where you've struggled, or kind of any tips that you need on any of these techniques, and we'll make sure we try to get through some of them. So we'll start going through the first one, which is the direct observation. So in this method, so the direct observation method, as I mentioned, that if you have the option to start doing kind of building your collection analysis plan while the disaster is still ongoing, that is a great opportunity to start doing some also direct observation. So direct observation is very much like what it seems, right? You're observing directly the response going on. So for FEMA and for the region, we have what we call the National Response Coordination Center or the Regional Response Coordination Center, where we manage and coordinate the response. Many localities have emergency operations centers, right? So that's where your local city staff, everyone goes to respond and manage any type of incident that occurs. And so that's a great place to be doing direct observation because you're able to gather information about their work, and the key point here is that you're really not interfering, right? So here's one example of a hurricane in Florida, right? So continuous improvement personnel attended meetings with the response staff and noted major operational challenges and strengths in real time. And so because you're just there like a fly on the wall, listening in to what's going on, you're able to kind of capture things in the raw state of how they developed, right? And so later on, you're able to use some of this information to influence the questions you ask in interviews. Maybe doing some direct observation on the early phases helps you really finalize what are the focus areas that you should be using in your collection analysis plan, right? So that helps you determine, oh, it looks like we had a challenge here that was more difficult than this other part of the operation. And so why don't we focus the rest of our data collection a little bit more on that aspect, right? And so this can also help you refine your collection analysis plan in some ways. And so if you have a massive response operation that's going on in multiple locations, then it may require a number of individuals to staff up. So for example, for FEMA, at FEMA headquarters, for the coronavirus response, we actually had a team probably of over 10 continuous improvement personnel embedded with a number of different task forces and meetings and jumping in on calls and things to try to ensure we had good coverage of everything that was going on, right? But we obviously had the resources to do that. However, for some of you that are just starting out on this process, it might be, you might have to choose, right? And so you might have to be intentional about which meetings you attend or which ones you're able to observe, right? And so you'll have to make those choices as you do some of this observation. And so we'll go on to the next method here. And so the next method is the document review. So here, this is something that you can start doing while the response is ongoing, but you can also do it after the fact. So the document review, here's a quick example, right? So you're reviewing incident action plans, right, for this major flood in Austin, Texas. So an incident action plan, it includes what are the next primary goals and activities that they want to do in the response for the next operational period, right, which can be about 12 hours, it could be about 24 hours, but it basically outlines what are the intentions for the next plan. Then they also looked at field reports, press releases, some geospatial products, relevant plans, and interagency agreements, right? So basically, documentation review is you're looking at everything that is just a document that was produced before or during an incident, right? And some of this information here is super valuable because when you're interviewing individuals, they might not recall exactly when they made that decision or when this resource moved from the logistics warehouse to the front lines response operation, right? And so as you review these documents, you're able to actually track and fill in some of those gaps, especially if you're trying to reconstruct an event timeline or things like that, then it's really helpful to be able to do these document reviews. And then this can also be helpful for information you hear in an interview, right? So someone gives you a hint of something that occurred, well then you can go back and look into the incident action plans and see if that issue was tracked, right? They mentioned something was a big issue, and so now you have a better sense of what am I looking for as I review these documents. It can certainly be time-consuming and labor-intensive. So again, there are way more documents that were produced in an incident than you will ever have possible time to review. So again, that's where your collection analysis plan is really important because then it'll give you a guide for what to collect, what to review, and what is more important than other documents to review. So we'll go on to the next method here. So the next method is the information management systems and the source databases. So there's a lot of information, right, that sure, it's produced in the document and there's a kind of final product. But there's also a number of databases that, an example here is financial transactions, right? How much money was actually spent in this response? Folks might remember some of those things and they could rat off some numbers, but the real data for that information, like the most valid source of data you can get, is probably going back to, say, a financial system to get that information. If, say, you're also looking at how things moved in a logistics system, well, maybe you actually want to look at that to actually have real numbers for commodities that got moved in different systems. And so a key thing here is that you want to make sure that you have subject matter experts or like have the appropriate guidance to interpret the data, right? Because sometimes when you extract the data from some of these systems, it comes out with a bunch of data fields into an Excel sheet, and you may not know the difference between one field or another just based on the name of the field. And so it's important that you're able to work with someone that can help you interpret the data, make sure that you're analyzing in the correct way. And again, you might have to have familiarity with the system of the database. You might need to get access to the data system. And so these are the types of things you want to start working with within your organization to let them know that for future incidents, we'd love to have access to this data system or that data system, right? And before an incident occurs, you want to try to get trained up on how to use these systems, make sure you have access to this information for the purposes of an after-action review. The next method we're going to talk about is the interview. So many of you mentioned that you have been a part of interviews, and so this is without a doubt one of the most commonly used methods. And so as I was mentioning, there's things that are really useful in interviews, and there's things that aren't as useful to get out of an interview, right? So for each of these methods, as you're thinking about which ones to include in your collection analysis plan, you want to be thinking about what is the best source of data, right? So in an interview here, right, it's a way to get perspectives from an individual or from a group after an incident of an exercise, right, on what happened and why did it happen. We encourage you to, if possible, and if you have the resources, to actually do interviews more on an individual basis, so you can get actually the unique perspective. Because sometimes when you interview in a group, so you're interviewing 2 or 3 individuals, and we usually would not recommend more than a group interview of 3, the information may be, individuals may not be comfortable sharing kind of their own perspective. They might just go ahead and say whatever the group or whoever spoke before them said, right? So if you have the ability, then individual interviews are often provide more direct information directly from that person. So here's an example of an interview about learning about the communications issue that was interfering with situational awareness, right? The key thing here is that they probed for more detail, right? So this is one great tool about interviews, is that you start the interview with your key questions here to ask in the interview that all tie back to your collective analysis plan and the focus areas you want. And so you'll ask those questions, but as they mention things, you need to be ready to start asking some follow-up questions, right? Start probing for more details, especially if it's on an area that you know you want to include within the after-action report. So this helps you really understand a lot more details and explore different perspectives on an issue, right? So if you're looking at some issue, you want to try to interview folks that were involved on kind of both sides of an issue, right? So if there's a problem, say, for moving logistical supplies from one location to another, well, you probably also want to talk to the logistics persons, but you also probably want to talk to the individuals that were receiving the supplies, right? So you want to try to capture information from all different perspectives. And so interviews is really the best way to involve subject matter experts, right? The folks that were directly in the response, the leadership that had to make those tough decisions, right? And just a word of caution, so it can be difficult to schedule these during a response or right after a response to an incident. And so you want to kind of set the tone that during the response, you'll let individuals know that, oh, I'd love to schedule time for you later on when you're available so we can talk and ask you a few more detailed questions about what happened in the meeting today. And so you want to kind of start having those conversations to schedule those interviews, because soon after an incident is starting to conclude, individuals may start departing, and so you may lose a chance to interview, right? So you want to be ready to go as soon as you have that first opportunity. And we often recommend to have a note taker in addition to the main person doing the interview. So this facilitates to make sure that you're able to capture everything from the interview, right? So you'll have one person facilitating and another person taking notes. Great, and so we'll go ahead on to the next topic.
Hello.
And the next topic is the feedbacks, forms, and survey. And so for this method, as we were mentioning in the collection analysis plan, if you are a team of 1 doing this review, well, developing a really good form or a really good survey is actually a great way to gather information for an incident. So you'll develop a series of questions, right, that are sent to a predefined group of respondents, right? So you want to make sure you know exactly who you're surveying, because you might want to ask slightly different questions to the individuals that were in a leadership position versus the ones that were in a more direct support or working with survivors, for example, right? And there's many online survey methods out there that you could possibly use, but some of them will include what they call skip question logic, where you can actually, depending on what they answer in the first question, you can actually have them answer different questions, right? So if they say that I'm in a leadership position, then now they get all the leadership questions. If they say I was in the front lines with survivors, then they get those questions, right? So this information, right, so here's an example of collecting feedback from response staff about the challenges it faced and where they needed additional resources, right? So this is a good example of trying to gather a large kind of swath of information, right? And sometimes you also want to think about the timing of your survey. Are you doing the survey kind of right at the beginning of the incident, towards the end of the incident? Maybe everyone has, the incident has completed and now you're asking folks to recall what were the major challenges. So depending on when the survey will be reaching the intended participants, you want to be careful to craft those questions accordingly. And so if you have the chance, so sometimes we've used surveys prior to interview, right? So we maybe do a large kind of broad survey to a larger number of folks to find out what are the major challenges. Then when we do an interview, we can actually follow up on those major challenges to someone that was maybe in a leadership position that would have helped address some of those, right? So that's a way to use that information. The other way is also kind of on the reverse side, right? So you maybe do some interviews, and now you've found out what are the major challenges in the operation. So now you want to ask more specific questions about those challenges to a broader group, and so you're able to do that after the fact. And so again, this is, as I mentioned, it's very easy to provide this, right, because folks can log in and participate. However, you'll want to do as much as you can to encourage participation, right? So having leadership send out reminder emails, having the survey automatically send a reminder email if they have not completed it, right? So setting that tone increases your response rate, which will be very helpful to make sure that you're actually getting more comprehensive perspectives through your survey. Just a word of caution here. So open-ended questions, which can be very helpful for folks to provide feedback, but as many of you have probably taken a lot of surveys in your life, if you open a survey and it has all open-ended questions, many folks will just close out the survey and not even take it. So you want to probably have more kind of numerical or kind of rating questions that they answer, you know, check the box and things like that on the early part of the survey, and more of the kind of narrative pieces later on as needed, right? You want to be very intentional because analyzing all those narrative responses can also be quite time-consuming as well. So just be very intentional, and we want to make sure that you always pilot test the survey prior to using it. Too many surveys are administered without ever being pilot tested. And so when you pilot test a survey, you want to have someone take the survey in front of you and tell you what is going through their mind as they're answering each question to be able to provide support and guidance. And so they can tell you, oh, I really want to answer this, but that's not an option, so I should modify the question or the answer options. So you definitely want to pilot test the survey at least a few times before ever administrating it. And so now we'll look at the next method, and so we're looking at hot washes. So when you look at hot washes, so many of you have mentioned hot washes as one of the tools that you used. So it's a facilitated group discussion, right, held after an incident. So the key thing here in terms of like the difference between a hot wash and a kind of a group interview, as we talked about. So hot wash, you are intentionally wanting to create a dialogue and a conversation, right? So you have come up with just a few questions. So say you're doing an hour-long hot wash, all you might need are about 4 or 5 questions, right? Because you're bringing together a few individuals together in a room or possibly in a virtual environment to discuss a few key topics, right? So you always want to think about who should be in this hot wash, right? Have individuals probably of similar levels. That way they can, you don't feel like there's one leader from your organization in the group that then will dominate the conversation, right? So you want to be careful about how you structure, right? Have a good balance of leadership and staff, or just have all staff or all leadership. And then just a few questions to really instigate the conversation and discussion. And so, so here's an example in New York City, right? Participants discuss potential challenges and solutions, right? And so maybe what you had was like 3 specific challenges you wanted them to discuss. And now they can all throw ideas and bounce off each other and hopefully at the end of the hot wash have a better idea of what is the best way forward. And so that's kind of one way of using a hot wash. But again, it's really, you want to have dialogue. You're bringing folks in that have opinions that they do want to share. And you want to make sure that this is done in a way that the facilitation of a hot wash is definitely an art to make sure that everyone participates, right? You don't want one person to dominate the conversation. And so you want to make sure that everyone's able to participate as needed. So great. So those were all the methods that we'll talk about today. There's many more that you could use, and if someone has questions about different methods, we're happy to address those as well. But we'll go on to the validation phase. So what is the validation phase? So in the validation phase, we're looking at a few different things. So we're looking at the 2 big components here are the data analysis and then the reporting, right? So you've collected all this information through the prior phase, right, through the discovery phase. And so now you need to start analyzing all this information and start reporting out that information through observations, courses of actions, right? And so this is exactly where you want to validate that the information you received is correct. And that's why you're analyzing, you're comparing the different sources of data you got. So you want to make sure the accuracy of the observations, right? So this is a very important step, right? Discovery takes a lot of time to collect all the information, but you should also spend a lot of time here making sure that you're able to analyze the information. And so we're going to talk through a few different methods of how you can analyze the information you received from the prior phase of discovery. So in the data analysis techniques, there's a few different methods, and we'll talk about them each in a little bit of detail. But I'll spend a little more time on the trend analysis as it often seems that leadership in many types of organizations is excited or really interested in having a trend analysis. So the synthesis collection here, right? So this is where you're able to identify common issues, right? So as I was just mentioning, you might hear something in a survey, you might hear something else in a hot wash, through your document review, you found other things. And so this is where you can do a synthesis or compile and review all the data from different types of sources, right? So kind of bring it all together, identify what are the common issues, right? So in your collection analysis plan, you had the major focus areas you were looking at, and now you actually have more details about each of those focus areas, right? So maybe you were looking at disaster staffing as a broad concept at the onset, but now you know that from all the various data sources, it was actually the timing of when staff arrived on the disaster that is really the common issue that you heard through the survey, through the hot wash, and through the interviews, right? So that's one way that you kind of like synthesize that information. So another method you could use is the event reconstruction. And so you consolidate information from multiple sources to create a fact-based account of what actually happened, right? So sometimes leadership wants to know what was the sequencing of decisions, how did those things happen, and so this is an event reconstruction. And then another example here is the root cause analysis. And so this is a structured process for finding kind of how do we get to the specific outcome, right? So what were the specific things that led to this being the final outcome, right? And so for this, I'm actually going to turn it to Tammy from Puerto Rico to give us an example of how they're using root cause analysis.
Thank you very much, Donnell. So as you mentioned, the root cause analysis is an extremely important piece in this type of project that often gets overlooked. If you don't target the root cause of a problem, you might be coming up with courses of action that might not actually solve the problem, or that might not be the best solution or the most cost efficient in some cases. There are many techniques you can use to perform a root cause analysis, and I'll give you an example of a very simple one that we call the 5 whys. And I'll give you a classic example of how to use the 5 whys. In this example, the problem is that one of the monuments in the Washington, D.C. is deteriorating. So we start our analysis by asking the first why. Why is the monument deteriorating? Because harsh chemicals are frequently used to clean the monument. Then we proceed to our second why. Why are harsh chemicals being used? Oh, to clean off the large number of bird droppings on the monument. We proceed to our third why. Why are there a large number of bird droppings on the monument? Because large populations of spiders in and around the monument are a food source to the local birds. We go to our fourth why. Why is there a large population of spiders in and around the monument? Because many insects on which the spiders feed are drawn to the monument during the evening. We go to our last why. Why are many insects drawn to the monument during the evening? Because the lighting of the monument in the evening attracts the local insects. So in this way, we can target that last item, which is our root cause, and we can simply change how we're lighting the monument or change the times when we're turning on the lights in the monument. And as you can see, if we were to target the problem at any other point, we wouldn't really be hitting that root cause, and we might not be solving the problem or wasting unnecessary funds. And this is a very simple example of how we can use the 5 whys to perform a root cause analysis. But of course, this is used in many different industries and agencies for both simple and more complex projects. But that is just a small example.
Great, thank you, Tammy. So we'll now go on to talking a little bit about trend analysis, right? So as I mentioned, this is an area where leadership is often really excited and interested to see this type of work. So this is helpful to identify reoccurring strengths or challenges that might be happening over time, right? And so this is where having that collection analysis plan is really important, because if you're able to do this type of work that you're doing for multiple incidents, right? Well, maybe there's an opportunity to have some collection priorities, right? Some focus areas that are consistent across different incidents, right? So then at the end of the year, maybe you can roll up all those findings you had, all those observations you had on one of those focus areas, right? Because you had a collection analysis plan that no matter what the incident was collected on, say, staffing issues, right? So then at the end of the year, you can do possibly an analysis of all the staffing issues and why was an issue in one disaster not another, and you can sort of roll these things up for leadership. Because leadership oftentimes doesn't want to take action on, say, any one incident, right? They're like, oh, well, maybe that was just a one-off. That's not normally how things happen. But if you're able to demonstrate that this is a trend, right, that it is always the case that staff are not able to arrive as when needed on a disaster site, and that's been the case through a fire, through a flood, through another type of incident, then now leadership can figure out, oh, maybe there's some bigger challenges or structural issues that we're facing for why this is the case, right? And that's where oftentimes through a trend analysis will be how leadership will be able to make some maybe different budget decisions or priority decisions to fix some of these bigger issues that maybe are harder to tackle, but you're able to demonstrate that this is happening time and time again. And then real-time analysis is conducting analysis during an ongoing operation. And so this is, if you're able to start doing some collection, right? So as we mentioned, maybe you're starting to do direct observation while the disaster is still ongoing. Well, then maybe you're starting to see that there's a disconnect. Maybe the individuals from one area of the response are actually speaking about things differently than some other area, right? So maybe there's a disconnect between those that are providing direct service to the survivors of an incident and those that are providing supplies to the survivors, right? And so maybe there's a disconnect and you're able to do this kind of real-time analysis and raise some issues for leadership in terms of the various things that could be happening real-time, and you're actually able to solve some issues before you finish your bigger after-action review process. You're able to directly tell leadership some of these areas that are seemingly coming up as challenges. You may later on in your after-action review process look deeper into those things and try to find out why that was the case, but sometimes you can do this analysis to kind of elevate these issues. And so now we're going to ask a question. So having heard the descriptions, right, which ones do you think you could apply to your work and why? So we'll bring another question in here. Yeah, so give us some ideas of which of these methods you think maybe you could apply to your work. Yeah, all techniques, root cause analysis. Sounds good. And yeah, event reconstruction. Yeah, there's oftentimes a lot of reports have event reconstruction, even if it's just a very summary high level. Many reports will include a summary of what are the major things that occurred. The synthesis, okay, good. So it seems like there's a good variety of folks that are able to use the various methods. So that's great, and we look forward to discussing these more in the Q&A session at the end. So we'll go on to looking at, so once you do all this analysis, now you're ready to start reporting out on observations. So the information you've gathered, right? So you've gathered all this information, you've analyzed it, right? So you feel you have it validated, you have a good idea of what were the key issues. And so now through the observation, you're going to explain what occurred and you're going to provide all the various supporting evidence, right? So it should be an observation, right? So there's a few kind of key things of when you should kind of roll up your analysis into an observation, right? So you have enough supporting evidence from multiple sources, right? So you didn't hear this just from one source, you heard it from multiple sources. You want to make sure there's an impact, right? That there's a specific reason for why this is important, right? Like this impacted how we were able to respond, and we should be able to respond in a different way in future incidents, right? There's a rigorous synthesis, right? Maybe use the event reconstruction, root cause analysis. So some or all of these techniques have been used to come to that observation, that final conclusion, right? And that it's different from other observations, right? So you want to, your report hopefully is looking at the incident in a kind of a comprehensive way. So you don't want to focus all your observations in one area. You want to be able to look at across the incident and provide observations on different aspects, right? Because different individuals will be able to take on actions in different ways based on your report. So, and this is what I was mentioning, all of these could be compiled into an AAR, which is an after-action report, right? So this is kind of the broadest sense on how you create an after-action report, which will include all these observations. And so now we're going to talk about a little bit about the different types of observations. So we've talked about these a little bit already, right? So we have the strengths, right, where you're looking at anything that was yielded a better result than you expected, right? So, so this is something that was in policy, right? Something that has worked out really well. And so you're trying to demonstrate and capture this, right? And so that later on for other incidents, you can hopefully continue using these strengths. You also have potential best practices, right? Maybe there's a way that you innovated in this response that was really helpful, and so you want to be able to capture that for future incidents. Areas for improvements are probably one of the more common ones that you've heard about. So this is where something didn't go as planned and there's some issue that could be solved to make sure that it is helpful for the future. So one that we haven't talked about a little bit is mission critical. So this one really comes up when you're actually doing real-time analysis in a disaster, right? And say you're actually finding out something that is of a key issue, right? Or maybe there's going to be an impact to the mission. There's a possibly dangerous situation, right? You hear about maybe a group of responders. They're about to go into an area that you heard in another meeting is actually not safe for responders to go to. Well, this is where you might have a mission critical finding, and so you want to elevate these as quickly as possible. And sometimes it might literally be just an email to your leadership letting them know, I'm hearing these things, these different discrepancies. Sometimes it might be a phone call, then you're like, I want to raise this issue and I'll follow up with some more details. But these are things that you really feel need immediate action, right, to senior leadership consideration. So that's just one other type of finding that we have, one type of observation that we haven't discussed much, and so I want to highlight that. So now let's go into a little bit more detail on what is the various elements that take part in an observation. So to have a really strong observation would include these things. Now, this is really the ideal state, that a really strong, well-thought-out observation will include all these. You want to at least hint to these various elements in some way, but if you're a one-person individual doing all this work, you may not have the chance to really flush these out in a large way, right? But the key thing you want to include here for sure is a topic sentence that makes a very clear claim about what happened on a very specific topic, right, that's connected back to your collection analysis plan, and describe the impact, right? So many times leadership is very busy and will not have a chance to read your whole observation. So you basically want them to read that topic sentence and know exactly what happened, on what topic, and what was the impact, right? You want that to be super clear. And that's oftentimes what you will include in sort of a presentation that you'll do on your written report. Maybe you'll just include the topic sentences, right? Then the discussion of evidence, we'll talk about how you got to that conclusion, right? Everything you did, right? You interviewed a number of individuals. This is how you synthesize the data. This is what happened, why it happened, and this is the impact, right? So you're able to kind of flush out a bit more detail everything that happened. And the desired outcome, right? So if you're able to capture, and sometimes it's harder than other times to define this, if you're able to capture the ideal future state of this is what occurred, but this is what we'd like to have happened, right? So this is really important for when you're writing up an observation for an area for improvement, right? So this is what occurred, but we'd like this to be the reality, right? And the way you get there would be through implementing the COA, which stands for course of action, right? So these are the actions that we go to, and if they were taken, they would assure that you get to that outcome, or at least a little closer to that outcome, right? And so oftentimes during the process, you may not have time to come up with a lot of COAs, and so these could come up later when you're reviewing the report with subject matter experts. Maybe you do some additional interviews at the end of your process to share these observations I have. How can we fix these issues so that we get to the desired outcome? So that's an area where oftentimes you maybe don't have initially in your observation, and you're able to develop them later on. And so with that, we have finished overall the validation phase of continuous improvement. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what is the resolution phase. So this phase here is actually for more organizations that kind of are a little more robust in their continuous improvement program, right? So they've developed a little more mature program and are ready kind of to start doing this type of work. But I'll give you some quick highlights of what are the key things that you would be looking at if you're at the stage or about to start in this process. So the resolution phase includes the improvement planning workshop and also the courses of actions, right, that are developed for an action plan, right? So we talked a lot about the courses of actions, right? So at the end of an observation, you want to figure out what are these courses of actions. And so that's what the improvement planning workshop and the action plan will help you do that. And so let's go through a little bit of what are courses of action. And so that's going to be the next topic that we'll talk about. So a course of action needs to be validated based on validated observations, right? So as we talked about in the prior slide, you want to make sure you get to these conclusions based on a really robust synthesis and analysis you've done through your process. You'll review these with subject matter experts that might be more experienced in these topics than you. And you want to develop in coordination with the program office, right? So you'd never want to just present a course of action that hasn't been reviewed by the individuals that would be later on expected to implement that course of action, right? Because you might have heard one thing, but there might have been some things you weren't really thinking about, or it didn't come up in the interviews. So you want to make sure that the program office or whoever is going to be implementing that also would agree with your course of action. And have a clear timeline for completion. That's always essential, right? So that way you're able to track these courses of action, right? And sometimes you can implement some right away because it's maybe just a new instruction or guidance that needs to be put out. And others might need like a budget resource, right? Maybe we need another search and rescue team. That's really the course of action. Well, that might take a year to really establish. And so that's kind of some of the ways you would outline a timeline that's appropriate to that course of action. So the improvement planning workshop, this is where you can actually bring together a number of folks, everyone that maybe completed the analysis, your team that did this, the subject matter experts. And so together you can do some of these courses of actions, right? So this is where you can maybe have another focus group to really discuss courses of actions with everyone, right? You want to make sure that the folks that could possibly be responsible for implementing are also part of this course of action workshop, right? This implementation planning workshop. And so there's a lot of different ways to do this, right? And so let me turn it to Tammy in Puerto Rico that can give an example of how they've been doing some of the development of courses of action.
Sure. So as you mentioned, having a well-defined course of action is a very important piece to ensure that our analysis and our products are effective at actually promoting improvement. If we don't have a clear course of action, this might lead to all of your work and analysis not being implemented or considered because we didn't provide actionable recommendations. When developing a course of action, in addition to what Danielle mentioned, my recommendations would be to ensure that they are attributed to a specific team or position and that they are not too general or vague. It's important to make them as specific as possible. And I would also recommend adding a timeline or a time frame. And I'll give you an example. The first course of action I have is ensure regular training. As you can probably notice, that doesn't have an actionable party, it doesn't give me a timeline, and it's very vague. That's not going to help our customers or stakeholders take our analysis for action. So a better course of action would be the training department lead must ensure biweekly trainings on the use of WebTA. As you can see, this example tells me who is responsible for carrying out that action, how often this needs to be done, and specifically, in this case, we're talking about training, specifically which training they need to provide. So this is just an example of how you can start working to formulate your courses of action.
Great, thank you, Tammy. And so now we're going to go on to the next phase, and this is the final phase that we'll cover today. So I encourage you to start putting in some of your questions in the Q&A box to make sure that we're able to answer all your questions at the end, as we've covered a number of materials and topics. So with the evaluation phase, so this includes two kind of key components, building off what Tammy was saying about action, tracking courses of action, right? So you want to be able to track the courses of action, right, to ensure accountability and make sure these are implemented correctly, right, as intended, right? And you also want to make sure you're able to share information with all the relevant stakeholders. Again, so this phase, right, this might be more for organizations that have a continuous improvement program, a little more established, right, because you've probably had a number of courses of actions, a number of evaluation reports, and so you're able to start developing these, right? But it's never too early to start, right? So you want to, for any report you do, if you can start working these into your process, that way leadership and everyone's aware of kind of how you go from a report that has all your courses of actions and recommendations to then being implemented. So one way to do that is through the action tracking. And so the action tracking here, right, so as Tammy's example was mentioning, right, you want to make sure there's accountability, right? So how are we going to make sure that these courses of actions are implemented? So oftentimes you establish an accountability plan manager or accountable tracking body. Maybe it's sort of an entity or office that will track for your organization all the various courses of actions that came out of prior after-action review processes. And so you want, what they're tracking is that you're doing the implementation is going to the timelines that you established, right? So if you have a timeline, are they progressing as intended, right? If there's a course of action that's supposed to be completed next month, then the month before, you might start asking those questions to find out if they're on track. Resource shortfalls, right? So maybe there was intention to implement some course of action, but at the end of the day, they actually didn't have the budgetary funds they expected. And so now there's actually a shortfall, right? And so they might have to readjust the timeline that they had originally intended. And that's what this action plan manager may be able to do with the various offices that are trying to implement courses of action. And again, as we talked about before, if there's other potential risks or limiting factors, right? So maybe they were about to release a whole new training program to address some prior courses of action. However, a disaster occurred and now resources had to go there, right? And so that training wasn't able to happen, right? And so some of these things that you're able to track for and account for are able to help make sure that there's overall tracking of all the courses of actions that have been developed that you've helped identify and make sure they're actually happening, right? And at the end of the day, the ideal state is that these happen before the next disaster, right? So that your organization can actually learn from the prior disasters and improve for the next one. So, and one key thing to mention is that as you might be just starting, some of you mentioned that this is kind of a newer part of your organization, that you're taking this on now. So if you don't have an action plan manager or no real accountability function, that's okay, right? You can simply use your past after action reports to serve as that accountability, right? Say, here's my report from the last hurricane. As we start getting ready for this hurricane season, these were the things that came up. Have we been able to address some of these, right? So this can really also be a very simple process, right? So I've talked about it at kind of the more complex level, but please adapt it to what works for your organization. So now we're going to turn to Michelle in Region 2 from FEMA to talk about how they do some action tracking.
Hi, thanks, Danelle. So we in the region just use Excel, an Excel spreadsheet to track the corrective actions that come out of the after action reports or other products that we produce after disasters and exercises. So me as the continuous improvement coordinator, I'm sort of, the action tracking manager for the region. So we have one Excel spreadsheet that has tracked all corrective actions over time, going back even 5-10 years, so before I was in this position. So I can see, the progress on each COA over time and see where there are still gaps. But one of the other things that you can do to help spread continuous improvement throughout your organization or your agency is to actually create an action tracking spreadsheet and give it to the stakeholder. So oftentimes, instead of producing an after action report for, FEMA Region 2, I might go out and help, a state or territory to produce their own after action report or a different branch. So what you can do is set up an Excel spreadsheet for them to track the key pieces of information. So what was the shortfall? What was the best practice? What is the corrective action that has been, tied to that? And who is responsible? And then give that to them so they can take ownership over the actual implementation of those corrective actions. The key thing here is to ensure that you're getting buy-in. So the buy-in that you established through creating your collection analysis plan and maintained through your collection and validation phases is really important here, because if people aren't involved in the process of actually implementing those actions, then the likelihood of them being implemented is much lower.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And so now that was the final major phase we're going to talk about today. But how do you bring this all together, right? How do you make a continuous improvement program effective, right? And so while I mentioned that the last two phases we talked about were kind of applicable only to those that maybe have been doing this for a little longer, everything we're going to discuss now is really applicable to every level of organization, no matter what stage you're at with your continuous improvement program. So here are some of the key things that identify a successful program. And so we'll go through these, and then I want to hear from you in terms of what other techniques you also would suggest make a program successful. So the first one here, obtaining commitment throughout the organization. So as we talked about, you want to be able to interview staff and individuals at all levels, right? the only way you're able to make sure that you have a good comprehensive after-action report is when you've been able to get that perspective from everyone, right? And everyone believes and is moving towards the same continuous improvement goals, right? So that just makes sure that your work is representative of everyone at every level. You want to make sure everyone's involved, right? So this is involvement both in the interview levels, maybe the analysis. We talked about the data management systems, right? So you're maybe working with some of the data analysts within the organization to help you analyze some data, right? So having everyone involved is very helpful to make sure that you have all those perspectives and you're looking at it through all the right lenses. You want to maintain strong communications, right? So things will change from what you originally set out to do in your collection analysis plan to what eventually makes into the after-action report. Maybe there was one focus area that you actually weren't able to get enough interviews to really feel comfortable to develop an observation. And that's okay, like those things happen, right? But you want to be able to maintain that communication and let everyone know that this is where you're at and this is what phase of the process you're at, right? And then you also want to make sure that as the after-action review process is finished, if individuals want to know, like, what happens, right? What happened to all those courses of actions, right? So you want to try to maintain communications with those that were involved in the process until each course of action is completed, right? Because that gets them buy-in for your next process, the next time you ask them for an interview, that they'll understand the whole cycle of everything and how it all leads from the beginning to the end. So, and then the last one point here that's really important is that you want to routinely revisit your continuous improvement activities, right? So not only are you trying to help the organization improve and be better, but you also want to turn that lens inward and look at your work, right? So is there a different way you could have structured interviews? Would there have been better questions? Is there data that you didn't analyze that maybe would have helped provided more supported finding or more evidence for a finding, right? Or for an observation. So you want to really think about how you could do your own work. How could you improve your own continuous improvement program every time, right? So ideally, after every report, after every process you do, you want to regroup with the team. You also want to get feedback from leadership about how this could have been even better for the next time that you do those, right? And the final point here is that you want to remain patient, right? So it takes a while to get things going. Sometimes you will have folks that aren't as supportive, and that's okay. You want to think about kind of the longer end, that you're overall trying to help the organization grow. And maybe you had large ambitions, but for this project, you have to kind of just be patient and buckle down and only write observations in certain areas because that's where you're able to get information. That's okay. So remain patient, but it takes time to really build a big program and to get everyone's commitment to the continuous improvement process. And so why don't we now ask the question of what else have you done that makes your program successful? And as you're typing in those answers, we're going to also turn it to Tammy from Puerto Rico to answer about how she's managed a successful team and how they've overcome some struggles.
Thank you, Danielle. So I'm going to provide some recommendations on specifically when you're setting up the team. Hopefully some of the participants we have on the line will have an opportunity to set up the team from scratch. So some of my recommendations based on the experience here in Puerto Rico would be to start off with a clear understanding of leadership expectations and needs. So what is it that your leadership really needs? Do they need a team or a person that focuses on conducting after-action reviews and producing the report? Or do they need perhaps someone who can just facilitate that type of conversation? Once you have a clear understanding of your leadership needs and expectations, you'll be able to gather the right skill set for your team, and you'll be set up for success in that way. The second thing I would recommend is having a set list of services and products. So that way you can better explain to stakeholders and to other programs and to people outside of your team what you can actually provide in very concrete terms. We can produce this type of report, we can facilitate this type of meeting, and that also helps the team members understand the expectations of their work. And lastly, I would recommend you structure and standardize a process by which others can request your assistance. So will your projects be determined by senior leadership and then be pushed down to the team, or can anyone request your services? If that's the case, how can other people request your services and your support? In the Puerto Rico team, we have a very structured way in which others can request our assistance. So our services are open to everyone in the operation. We definitely prioritize leadership projects, but our services are open to everyone. And there is a standardized process where they have to submit a project request form. Then we have a scoping meeting with the stakeholder, and then we have several follow-up meetings during the project to make sure that we keep the stakeholder engaged until we finalize it. But it's a very structured process, and it has been very effective for us. So I definitely recommend you all take that into consideration if you plan to put together a continuous improvement team. Thank you.
Thank you, Tami. So great. And so we've had a number of folks write in regarding what makes a program successful. And so let's look at some of those responses. We have, looking at all levels of leadership, listening at all levels. Listening is a huge skill that you'll develop as you engage on all this work. Looking also at buy-in for the process, right? That's also really important, right? So if you maintain good communications, hopefully you'll get buy-in into the whole process. Show the team how improvements, right, will make their specific conditions, task, or easier, right? So exactly. So you can show, maybe based on some of your past work, what some of those direct improvements have resulted as a result of participating in an after-action review process, right? So those are also some ways that you're able to help. And clear expectations. Yep, that's also a really important one, right? We talked about that at the beginning, and that's one of the key things for having a good collection analysis plan, that you're really outlining what are the things to expect out of this process and what to not expect, right? So while everyone may have a lot of ideas of what you could do, there's only certain things that you can do or have the time or resources to do. But that's actually a great transition to the next section, which is what else does continuous improvement program do? So today we really talked about an after-action review, right? And that oftentimes results in sort of an after-action report, and that's the one that you see highlighted here, right? So we talked about all the various processes, right, that lead into that, developing observations, the collection analysis plan, all the data collection analysis, right, results in a very comprehensive after-action review. However, there's a lot of different ways you can do continuous improvement, and there's different products. And so let me just give you a quick highlight of some other things that you can do. So sometimes you can actually do a trend analysis that is really just a standalone trend analysis. That is the entire product, right? That could be a part of an after-action report like we talked about during the presentation, but that literally could be the product. That could be all that leadership wants you to do, right? Maybe you have a few reports and now they just want you to roll them up into some sort of a trend analysis. Or maybe they want you to look at a trend analysis within one operation, so that could also be. The after-action review and debrief, so this is more when you may not actually do a full after-action report, but maybe you'll do some interview, do some collection. At the end of the day, you'll just do maybe a meeting and you'll debrief together on what happened after an incident, right? So maybe there's not as much of a written product as you would have as we discussed earlier. The decision support products, these are more about the real-time data analysis, like we talked about, is one of the kind of methods you can use. So this is during an actual activation, you're able to help leadership make better decisions, right? And maybe based on your analysis, you're creating a pros and cons list. Maybe you're creating a ranked priority order for what they could do, right, based on what you're hearing, right? So these are products that are being used in the actual operation to make better decisions. And then you have exercise evaluation, right? We talked a lot more today about sort of in a real-world incident, but everything we talked about could also be applicable for an exercise. So a number of you mentioned that you're working on tabletop exercises, other functional exercises. All of this is directly transferable to that as well. So that's also another way you can use this information. And so with that, we've reached the end of the course. So go ahead and start writing in your questions so we can start answering them. And so just to quickly summarize the webinar and the presentation today. So we really hope that you've walked away with a few new ideas for how to do continuous improvement activities, right? We hope that this will help you improve your program. And again, please apply this to whatever level makes sense in your organization, right? If continuous improvement is not the right terminology, then change it to be evaluation work, to change it to be internal assessment division, whatever it is. The idea is that you're helping your organization improve as things move forward. So we're excited that you joined us today. We're going to give you some additional resources to help answer some of the questions that were coming in about asking for templates. And so here you can see there's the Continuous Improvement Planning Toolkit. So this is a resource that is open to everyone, all state, local, private, public participants, so everyone. It's an online website. You can sign up here, and then you click on the link it's a preptoolkit.fema.gov, and you'll want to sign up, register, so you have to register, have an account. And then once you're in there, you want to find our community, right? So we are called the Continuous Improvement Planning Toolkit. And there you'll see a ton of different tools and templates. I think there was folks asking about CAP templates and interview templates and things like that. So yes, you can find some of those. And I think a lot of those documents are actually in Word version. That way you can adapt them and use them however you need to for your purposes. So again, I just want to thank you so much for joining today. Hopefully you've learned something new or had some new insights that you can bring back to your organization. And so now we're going to turn it to the questions. So looking forward to answering any questions you might have, myself and the whole team that's here with you. So thank you again.
Thank you, Danelle. We have a few questions for you. Someone asked for task team AAR. Before we begin the AAR process, we always read and agree verbally to the rules that what's happened and said here stays here. So is that something that you recommend or to redefine?
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. And so there's different levels of kind of how much you want to contain the information internally, just for internal discussion versus externally, right? So at FEMA, we do a lot of reports that are, for the most part, internal to FEMA, right? But the idea within our organization, right, there's a continuous improvement kind of belief, and everyone's really trying to help do things better next time around. And so all of our internal reports do become public and accessible to all FEMA staff, right? Very few of our reports become accessible to kind of the broader public, right? We have probably the best example is the 2017 hurricane season after action report, which is a public-facing report, and myself and other members of the team were heavily involved in that report. So that will show you kind of what the end result looks like as well. That's one good resource for you. But in terms of what information and how to, like, what's said here stays here, so we oftentimes when we engage with interviewees and focus groups and hot washes, we'll let people know that we encourage them to discuss freely and to share openly, and that at our final products, we will not be doing any attribution to any individual, any person, right? So everything will be reported up at a higher aggregate level, right? So we encourage them to be really honest and forthcoming with information of what happened, so then we can actually look at the issues in the right ways, right? Because if someone's withholding information, then you're probably not able to write the observation with all the details you need to, right? And so you want to create an environment where there's a trust, right? And the way sometimes you build this is based on prior incidents, right? You've done an interview with them that they know that the interview notes are really just for the continuous improvement team that's working on the product, right? But those notes aren't going to be posted somewhere. Those notes are just for the internal deliberations of the team. And then from that, you'll do that synthesis and pull those key issues, right? So you want to kind of clarify some of those things. If people are still being skeptical about this information, then another suggestion could be to engage with your leadership and have them sort of make some opening comments or remarks about how this information will be used, and that they encourage everyone to be truthful and honest, right? And so you want to kind of capture that in some ways, right? But sometimes we've been a part of leadership conversations where we're invited to participate in the meeting, but we're told to not share what is discussed, right? And that's sometimes a great opportunity to understand kind of from leadership how decisions got made and how things happen, right? And when you then, that information, you can't directly use it in the report, but you at least have the context behind an observation or behind why something was more difficult than expected, right? Maybe there's things that aren't needed to be included in the report, but in terms of developing the courses of action, it's important to be aware of those things to make sure that the right individuals are involved. So those are some ways how I would tackle that.
Thank you. Do you encourage AAR work immediately beginning after SAR has been completed in a rescue mission during response and relief work?
Yeah, so it depends. It really depends on when you're able to start doing some of this collection, right? And so if there was a large search and rescue operation, and maybe if that's a key focus that they want an after-action review on this, right? And you're able to start doing some initial collection while the disaster is still ongoing, then maybe you can observe some of those things, right? Like how are they choosing where to send the search and rescue team? How are they choosing the resources that search and rescue team gets, right? And how are they prioritized, right? So maybe in terms of if they have to get to a location that's a little bit isolated, do they send supplies first? Do they send the search and rescue team first, right? And so some of this would be really helpful to make sure that you're able to address the issue, right? So if you can start doing some initial observations, like the direct observations like we talked about, then you definitely wanted to try to do that. However, with search and rescue operations, it is definitely a time-sensitive thing, right? And so you definitely don't want to get in the way of anything that's happening during the immediate onset of a disaster, right? And so I would encourage you to probably be more in a direct observation role than trying to interview someone that's on the search and rescue team to get that information. And so, yeah, so you want to try to start gathering information as soon as you can, and then later on when things calm down, maybe circle back and ask them questions about what you observed and how that information could be used. So that is some of the ways that you could look at doing search and rescue or incorporate kind of that as a focus area.
Thank you. We have one more question for you. If anybody else has a question, please type it in the Q&A box now. But can you please tell us, do you not typically use a capabilities-based structure to develop the AAR?
Great. And so here I'm imagining you're talking about the core capabilities, right? We're from the National Preparedness School. So yes, we oftentimes will use the core capabilities in terms of reporting out in terms of our observations and findings, right? So once we get to the end of the process, we might say, well, these observations align to these core capabilities. And oftentimes we'll find that observations and courses of actions really hit multiple capabilities, right? And so we may actually tag that in terms of our tracking system, right? Like we talked about having an action tracking system that would track all observations and the courses of actions. And that might be one of the fields that we tag it, right? So later on, if we want to do a filter by, say, the communications, right, capability, then we can actually filter by that capacity, right? Or maybe we're actually looking at another core capability. We want to filter by that. We want to look at plans or something else, right? So we're able to look at all the observations or all the courses of actions that relate to those capabilities. And also, when you're having those initial conversations with leadership in terms of what are the focus areas you should have on an after-action review, that could also be a way for you to instigate some of those conversations, right? And ask, we have these capabilities that we're thinking about focusing on. These others didn't seem to come up as much in this incident from your perspective, right? And so that could be a way you can help kind of pare down what are all the possible focus areas on the incident. So that's one way that you would use kind of capabilities in the incident as well. And if that's a terminology that is well known in your organization, then yes, then by all means, that could be a good way to structure your report and report out against capabilities that were mentioned.
Thank you so much, Danelle, and thank you to all our speakers today. Of course, as soon as I go to say thank you and goodbye, we got one more question.
Sounds great.
Do you encourage using consequences of not taking action to help get a buy? I don't know what this means. Get a buy OO? You know what that means?
So can you repeat the question?
Do you encourage using consequences of not taking action to help get a buy, maybe buy-in? It says buy OO.
It's
okay.
buy-in.
Buy-in. Okay, great. So sometimes possibly, right? And it really depends on kind of the trust that you've built with your individuals that are taking on your courses of actions for implementation. But especially if you have, during the collection phase, observed direct impacts from what would happen, right? So like, what is the desired state of how things should be? And you've been able to capture some of that, then hopefully you're able to include some of that in your conversations with leadership and when they're trying to define what are the courses of action that if we don't take action, then this is what could happen, right? Or this is what happened here. And this is also where the trend analysis that we talked about are really important as well, right? So maybe you can't get action to happen on some issue during the first time you report on it, but maybe you can the second or third time, right? And that's where you can do a trend analysis and say, look, we have not taken action on this area, and now it's coming up again, right? It came up in this flood. Now it came up in a hurricane. So now can we look at trying to prioritize this for action, right? And so you can sort of share some of that information as well. So that's maybe some of the ways that you can help facilitate that conversation, right? And as long as you have that trust built in, then you're able to ask some of those tough questions and show what are some of the possible outcomes as well. I also want to turn it to Tammy and Michelle in case they want to add in for any of the questions that were previously mentioned. Was there any other detail you want to answer from your perspective?
Hi, this is Tammy. Nothing on my end. I think you've covered everything. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Hi, this is Michelle. I think you've also covered everything quite well, so thank you.
Okay, great. So you always might make sure that there's the regional and the field perspective that might have different perspectives, right? So as you would doing an actual evaluation or abstraction report, you want to make sure you're able to include all perspectives. So thank you so much. Great. And so I think with that was the final question. We enjoyed getting to know everyone here through the chat boxes. So thank you so much. Please use our resources that we shared on the planning toolkit. As we have more resources, we'll add them there. And we're also in the process of developing an independent study course that will be through the Emergency Management Institute that will cover similar materials as were covered here. And we're also working out on building these sort of micro-learning sessions that will be 5 to 10-minute sessions on specific topics of interest. So one of them, for example, will be on interview techniques, one on focus groups and things like that. So we're building out a lot of these resources for all of you. So please reach back to the preparedness toolkit.fema.gov, and we'll be sharing and updating resources there. And we look excited to hear about how you start using some of this work. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Danelle, Tammy, and Michelle. That was a lot of really great information. I'm sure that you shared the email box if they have any questions. We have a number of webinars coming up. The same webinar that was provided today will also be provided in Spanish tomorrow. The link's on your screen if you'd like to attend. We have some other Spanish deliveries of SBA programs and cybersecurity coming up, as well as programming on stress management from COVID-19 being offered in both English and Spanish, and also dealing with grief and losses from COVID-19 are being offered in English and Spanish. The Consumer Bureau will be talking about different, how to avoid frauds, not only after a disaster, but they've been here in the past to talk about it, after COVID-19. So it seems like you really need a good disaster for people to take advantage. I've found these webinars to be extremely useful personally, and that will be offered in both English and Spanish. And then coming in July, who are the people in your neighborhood? So a little bit about community asset mapping and how to use the resources that you have that maybe you didn't realize. This webinar and all the webinars that FEMA Region 2 produces are recorded, and they are archived on the FEMA Region 2 site. Give us a couple of days, but definitely by next week, this webinar will be on our site. So if you know of anybody who would benefit from hearing today's webinar from beginning to end, please direct them to our site. Everyone is free to drop. Have a wonderful day.